Okay. So, my dear friends, thank you so much for coming today to our gathering. It is my pleasure to introduce session 16 of Unrehearsed Futures. It's a season 2, and we're celebrating as of last Friday our first birthday. Unrehearsed Futures turned 1 last Friday. Woohoo! So very, very exciting. There have been so many wonderful experiences already with Unrehearsed Futures. Tonight, this morning, whatever time zone it is for you, we are inaugurating 2 innovations. The first thing is that my esteemed colleague and longtime Unrehearsed Futures participant, Franc Chamberlain, I'm gesturing to his box, is going to be curating, and I'm going to be co-piloting. So this is a wonderful thing. Thank you, Frank, for taking the wheel. And the second innovation is that we have decided that we are going to split the session, just try this as an experiment, into 2 halves. The first 45 minutes, roughly, we're going to record, and the second 45 minutes, we are going to stop recording. And we hope that this will enable the community discussion to be a little bit freer, less self-conscious. We can explore ideas without feeling that we have to have everything right the first time, that we are going to be recorded for infinite posterity. So we're hoping that it can be more of a discussion in the second half of the show. And as people who've attended before will know, after the show, we just hang out. So the show doesn't stop. So that bit will just sort of extend into everybody's afternoons, evenings, whatever you'd like to do if you want to stay. So this session, we're going to be considering together this very bedeviled issue of neutrality, and the subtitle is in actor training. The subtitle being "Help or Hindrance," and I'm going to leave it to Frank to introduce our 2 wonderful guests, Ellie and Madhu. But before that, I'm going to introduce Frank. So Franc Chamberlain is Emeritus Professor in Drama, Theatre and Performance at the University of Huddersfield in the United Kingdom. He is founding editor of the Routledge Performance Practitioners Series, which he continues to edit in collaboration with Bernadette Sweeney. He edited Contemporary Theatre Review for its first decade, as well as the book series Contemporary Theatre Studies. He's published on actor training, particularly on the works of Michael Chekhov, but also Descrew, Barba, and Lecoq. Frank regularly creates and co-creates performances addressing social issues. So thank you, Frank. And why don't I hand it over to you at this point?
Thank you, Amy. So we have 2 guests today. Madhu Natraj. Madhu Natraj is an award-winning choreographer, arts entrepreneur, curator, and educator, with over 300 choreographies to her credit and performances in over 36 countries. She studied contemporary dance in New York and founded the STEM company, Space, Time, Energy, Movement Dance Company, which comprises verticals of training performance, documentation, and outreach. Madhu has studied Indian martial art forms of Tong Ta, Kalari Payat, and several folk and ritualistic forms. She is a certified yoga teacher, pursuing a postgraduate studies in anthropology, and also heads India's premier dance education centre, the Natya Institute of Kathak and Choreography, founded by Dr. Maya Rao and Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, under the aegis of UNESCO. Wow. And Ellie Nixon trained at the École Jacques Lecoq International Theatre School in Paris from 1987 to 89. And in 89, she co-founded the La Mancha International Theatre Company. The company has produced over 25 theatre projects, performing throughout the UK, Europe, Scandinavia, Central and South America. Her research explores approaches to contemporary performance practice and performer training. She is currently running a BA acting course at Bath Spa University. Thank you. Welcome. How shall we kick off with this question of neutrality? Ellie, would you like to start?
Well, first of all, it's a really great honour to be sharing a platform with Madhu and Frank and Amy. and all of you. I've really enjoyed attending Unrehearsed for Futures when I can. I think the conversations when I can join them are very generous, and I have really enjoyed how presenters have been so honest in sharing their ideas and concerns and suggestions. So I've really been sort of picking up on the salient points as I've been attending all of these sessions. My particular interest in neutrality is related more with the book I'm writing, which is called Imagining Bodies and Performer Training. And it's really about connecting Lecoq's more poetic, the poetic dimension of Lecoq's training to the French philosopher Gaston Bachelard, and that sense of connecting relationally with the world, and particularly with the pre-Socratic elements of earth, air, fire and water. And so I'm really enjoying rethinking about the neutral mask. My training in the mask at the Lecoq School was an amazing reimagining or rethinking about what teaching and learning is. We weren't given a module outline or any suggestions of what we were going to be doing or any outcomes or learning outcomes. It was a journey of discovery. And I think that that is something that has inspired me in terms of the teaching at the Lecoq School. And so rather as a corrective tool, I think if we think of neutrality as something, yes, that helps us to make connections, to reveal, to think about space, to think about the world, and to think about connecting with others, rather than that sense of being in your own head. In a world predominantly rooted in what American psychologist Robert Sardello describes as a me cosmology, I think the neutral mask can decentralize our dependence on the role of the self. So there you go.
Wow. Madhu, do you want to pick up a response?
Thank you, Frank. Thank you, Frank. And I'd like to say a huge thank you to all of you for having invited me here. And initially, when I joined in, I thought I was the Lecoq pariah here because Ellie, Amy, and Frank sort of have had immersive training in the form. But very soon, they led me into the philosophy, and I started to find so many resonances in the Indian pedagogic technique. So neutrality as a concept is actually not taught as a separate phenomenon in Indian dance. So we are sort of led to that space through several processes. And the first is something that is common to almost all classical dance and martial art forms, which is the concept of the sadhana or the riyaz, which is through iteration, constantly repeating until your mind and body are saturated with the learning, that you find a point of counterbalance and of equipoise. And there you find your sense of neutrality. Also, the rhythm cycle is called sam or sama, which is also a term for neutral. In Sanskrit, sam means neutral. So if time is cyclical, you believe that you start at one point and then you return to that point, whether it's a 16-beat time cycle, 10-beat time cycle, whatever it is. And that kind of becomes your mandala to birth neutrality, in the sense that you travel, you collect all these experiences, and then you find, because contiguity is, you know, something that you find in India. You don't separate, you keep collecting until a point where you can distinguish. And I'd like to say in my Kathak training as a Kathak performer, the stance or the sthanaka is also called, you know, the sama, the starting point, the sama is start over here and you come back over here. So you layer as you start to create movement and you come back to the same spot. So in the sort of, how shall I say, the pure dance technique, there is actually a term for it, but not so when you look at the nritya aspect, where you're bringing in the expressive element. Also, there is one concept of becoming a character. So if the dancer is the conduit, if I'm a medium, then at one point I have to become the dance. And especially in this dance theater tradition, especially in the folk and operatic forms, we have a concept called the patra, or the patra pravesh. The patra is the vessel. So in order to take on the shape of that vessel, of that character, we first have to empty our own crucible, is what one is taught through time. And in order to receive that new experience and to become that character. Also, I wanted to say that there is a very interesting concept for neutrality in the Indian aesthetics and poetics, and it's called sadharanikarana, which means universalization of the rasa, or of that emotion that the audience has to feel. So in a sense, it's called the self-forgetfulness, in order to transfer that experience from a neutral space to an audience, who also in the Indian aesthetic concept are called the sahridaya, the co-resonators of this journey of dance. So this is where I'm coming from. I thought I'd offer a slightly different perspective from the Indian dance dramaturgy angle. Thank you.
Great.
Gosh, Ellie, do you want to respond to that? Does anything immediately leap out?
I think there are so many connections, and neutrality is often defined as feeling indifferent, nothing in particular, and a lack of preference for one way or the other. And I think that Madhu has just shown that it's not that at all, and that it doesn't mean ridding yourself of all your personal traits of moving, talking, or being. It doesn't mean ridding you of your habits or finding a correct posture. And I think what it does, perhaps in response to what Madhu's saying, is and I'm coming at it from a different angle. It sort of temporarily shatters our habitual ways of seeing, doing, and feeling, and it brings us back to that state that Haraway also terms as not knowing. Quite often we're so dependent on, I need to know what's going to happen before we do it, or Ellie, are we allowed to, or can we, or should we? And I think Madhu has described a really important cyclic, or a space of not knowing, which is what Donna Haraway terms it. She describes it as a quasi Buddhist value, and that the appreciation of not knowing and letting that be is something you learn in a serious relationship. It's a kind of letting go, and so I'm talking about it perhaps, I don't know, maybe more ethereally, but in terms of learning and teaching, that's what's obsessing me at the moment. But I think also that sense of starting from the same point, going on that journey, coming back to the same point, having that space where you can shift direction, change your ideas, be open to new ones. And I think that in those senses, perhaps Madhu and I connect.
The points of transition, of transformation, of moving from one thing to another, from one character to another. Madhu, do you want to?
Yes, absolutely, Frank. And Ellie, thank you so much for you articulate so beautifully. I get lost just listening to you. But yes, there is a concept also, I'm talking from my Kathak standpoint of what you call the Eka Patra Abhinaya. And if you'd like, at a later point, I can write all these terms down and send them to you all. Eka Patra Abhinaya is that one person who takes on several characters. So as a solo artist, most of our classical forms, germinate from the solo dance tradition, and only in the 20th century do you see them turning into group productions, for the proscenium. So if I have to play 5 characters in a span of 20 minutes, and I remember Ellie and Frank demonstrating to me with the mask how you use the neutral mask and become that element or a person. So we have various devices. One of them is called the palta, where you turn and you become a character. And it's almost like working with the polarities, and you have to have a lot of a mature dancer sometimes, I think, is the perfect conduit, because you have collected those experiences and you can shift from that space of neutrality to becoming the character and back. And also we looked at the similarities and how you shift from one to the other. I completely agree with you. It's not really about forgetting who you are, because how do you, sort of leave your cultural compass, in a sense, your imagery that you're informed by behind? And I think neutrality in that sense has to do with holding on to your distinction in some manner before you transfer into another character. So I will perform my Patra Abhinaya differently from Ellie, for example, but we will still create the same rasa in the audience of horror, of disgust, of whatever it is. In terms of teaching, these are again in India, as I said, everything is garbed in symbology so much that definitely neutrality, I understand, is an undercurrent, And so when I teach, if I teach Kathak, then of course it is at times to ask them to drop the other baggage or to unlearn. I'm constantly asking dancers to unlearn. In the contemporary scenario, sometimes dancers enter a space knowing that they are going to be trying movement that has a universality about it already. It's not sort of blocked by the rigidity of a certain form. And I find that over there, moving from neutrality to becoming that particular element, the dance itself, I sometimes find a little more easier in movement transference, I would say. So I just wanted to say that.
Could I add, also, just going right back to Lecoq on this point that Madhu brings up. I mean, he describes the neutral as a state of combining calm and curiosity. And I think that's what it's that space that we very rarely allow ourselves, particularly in what's happening in the contemporary world. But that as a learning group, as a group of learners together, along with the educator, we discover a sort of an accepted reference point that we work through and work out together. And it's through that, as Lecoq says, that we discover our own point of view. And so, of course, there's, as he says, there's no such thing as absolute and universal neutrality. It's merely a temptation. But that sensation of calm prior to action, a state of receptiveness to everything around us with no inner conflict, is absolutely that. I think it's actually a felt space. I don't think it's a rigid, it's not a nothing space. It's something that we can discover and feel and sense. I am in a neutral space as a reference point. And then when you do have to shift from character to character to character, you've been through that, the rigor probably of that training, and it becomes second nature to you. Coppo says something quite interesting, Madhu, that he says an actor must know how to be silent, to listen, to answer, to remain motionless, to start a gesture, follow through with it, come back to motionless and silence, with all the shadings and half tones that these actions imply.
I'm going to pick out something from the chat, if that's okay. Amy's asked the question, if we're looking at also at a mask and a dance form, is there not a tension between the repetition of existing form or having a form dictated and the not knowing to which you are both giving value? I think you might have just answered that.
I suppose the not knowing, riffing here, but I think that the not knowing is your availability or disponibility, saying it in Spanish, but thinking about it in terms of, yeah, it's a sort of, some people here would call it a pre-performance. It's a stepping stone towards something. It's not necessarily the performance itself. And I think, well, my interest is absolutely in its connection to that sense of the poetic. I mean, I'll never forget, because the teachers at the Lecoq School, of course, never show you how to do something. But I do remember Lecoq in the Queen Elizabeth Hall, I think it was the late 1980s, the first time I saw him wear one, and the impact of that, and getting a sense actually that it's about carrying a vibration, an amplification, a reaching out. You know, the walls of the Queen Elizabeth Hall stopped, the energy went beyond that. And so I think that that's an energy that you carry with you, or the resonance that you carry with you, that can go through the rigors of form. So for example, I'm writing something on judo as a devising form, but I think that they tune in to that disposition, or that availability that the mask offers. What do you think, Madhu?
I think in answer to that question, Ellie and Amy, I would think that I would think a balance of the two, of the value of iteration, because it gives you your muscle memory and also somatic intelligence in a sense. I mean, there are times, there were some pieces, and now I've been dancing for over 30 years. And I learned a lot through osmosis too. And you can wake me up in the middle of a night and there's a certain piece called the Tarana. I will do it, you know, without having to think at all. But it also allows me, in that sense, to lose myself, because in a sense, it's already got into my genetic memory in a sense. And I think I have to be able to, I wouldn't say have mastery over the form, but this ease of coming in and out, which allows me to also forget. So I think it's a strange collision of the two, but I would probably choose a balance. Does that make sense?
I think so. I'm wondering about they were talking a little bit earlier, Ellie, you were talking about kind of energy, and I became interested in the way in which you know, the techniques and the physical techniques, the ways of channeling or constructing flows of energy, yes. And so how this relates to neutrality. I mean, when we're working with the neutral mask, with neutrality, how does that work with what's a neutral energy, or there's a positive and negative? What's a neutral energy? Does that have any kind of meaning in this conversation?
I see it as a sense of, you know, an openness to resonance. That there's I live by a river, and there are lots of reeds in the river and kingfishers. And when a kingfisher sits on a reed, it's in constant vibration and movement, but appears to be still. It's a sort of an active space, a space of readiness in the moment, a way of corporeally or bodily listening that I think is, I think it's that sort of energy, which is a held energy, but it's it's a sense of vibration rather than a solid form. I mean, there's a beautiful moment which reflects, I think, that moment that I saw of Lecoq doing this. He just sort of opened his arms and he was wearing the neutral mask. There's an improvisation that we did at the Lecoq School that we carried on at our school in Chile, at La Mancha School of Image and Gesture, which is the fundamental journey, which was broken down beautifully by the staff at the Lecoq School. And you were in a way guided through the journey, but never told how to do it. And you bit by bit discovered that energy of this invisible terrain that you were actually inventing through the process of in an empty space, climbing mountains, going through water, running down mountains, going through forests, coming out of the sea. And then there's this beautiful moment at the top of the mountain, or when you're looking down or out, which I felt that Lecoq captured. And the French philosopher Gaston Bachelard calls it a panoramic gaze. And he says, in sweeping the gaze around the horizon, the dreamer takes possession of the whole earth, if only we take pains to look. And it's that sense of having an energy which isn't internal, but it's outward facing. Does that make sense, Frank?
It makes sense to me. Yeah. I'm just wondering here whether this is what you meant by equipoise, Madhu, when you did this idea of the image of the kingfisher balanced on the reed, sensing things prior to the kind of energetic movement. Yeah.
Yes, I think that nails it. Absolutely. I was also thinking of an instance. I mean, in cultural anthropology, you study before going into movement analysis. This ethnomusicologist called Kathak, and and he speaks of dances in harmony with the body and dances out of harmony with the body. So in harmony with the body are dances you sort of have control over. So the neutral space being your starting point, but the intent is completely different. Dances out of harmony with the body are more extroverted, hunting dances, could be, initiation ceremonies, but closed dances are to do with being closer to an imageless sense, to be closer to the womb, to the center of gravity, etc. And I think that's a fabulous example also of moving from a point of being hinged, as Ellie said about the kingfisher, and also creating this sort of expansion on the other hand. In Indian dance, like I said, everything used to be codified in order to maybe find your own voice a little later. You have the concept of Lasya and Tandava, which is the vigorous dancing, like the expanded dance, and the lyrical, which is the closed dance. And in a composition, in a progression, you can see both, and the ability to do that again comes through practice and iteration. I just thought I'd share that, because that image came to mind as Ellie was speaking.
Thank you.
There's something, Frank, going back to this sense of energy that Rosie Braidotti says. She offers a nomadic vision of the body as a multifunctional and complex transformer of flows, energies, effects, desires, and imaginings. And I think I'm just talking about the neutral mask at this point. It's that holding, it's a space for holding all of that. And it really gives a sense to the learner. I mean, I got it for the very first time in my life, having done a degree in acting and performing, I got a sense, and it was a slow process for me, of suddenly getting an embodied sense of who I am, of that, my fingers and my toes, and they all communicate, they all imagine, they all and also, yeah.
I think we've lost you, Ellie. You still there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, you dropped out for a second. Can you repeat that last bit again? Or is that...
Yeah, just that I think with the neutral mask for me, in my experience at the Lecoq School, was for the first time a sense of my embodied self, of in relation to the world, rather than being in my head all the time. I had the opportunity to develop myself and be myself and explore myself in relation to others and to other. The more than human, I suppose.
Would anybody like to comment on discussion so far? No?
I'm just... thank you. I'm just going to, I have a little bit of prior knowledge. Unrehearsed Futures is not entirely unrehearsed. Ha ha ha. I just wanted to, because I have some prior information about the anecdotes that you've both given, Madhu and Ellie, about how neutrality figured in your creation of new work. So I was particularly struck by those anecdotes. I remember, Madhu, you talked about that very eloquently. Would you mind telling us again about this wonderful, or me again and the group, about this experience, the way you position neutrality and innovation?
I'm wondering which one of those anecdotes. We shared a lot. I remember we had a 2-3 hour conversation. I just wanted to share an anecdote actually about a theater company that I worked with. But before that, something came to mind when Frank was asking us about is it possible to shift, completely. There is a dance form. If you see the folk and ritualistic forms and the jatras, of course, we have that vision of the female and the male dancer, the Ardhanarishwar, constantly shifting from one to the other, just one dancer, and they call impersonators. But there is also a very interesting character in folk forms who's the mediator character, who becomes female when he's talking to a woman to get her secrets, and then the same person turns around just the other side and becomes male and speaks to another. I just thought it was an interesting image. So I was telling Amy, Ellie, and Frank the other day that I've had the good fortune of working with several theater directors the past 2.5 decades, and one of them was in peculiar person, Dr. Karant, B.V. Karant, and he believed in the Natya tradition of each dancer being of course, trained in theater, but also a dancer and musician. And Rangayana is the theater company that he founded in Mysore. And these actors had training for 15 years or so. And they, one day, Mr. Karant calls me and says, Madhu, I want you to choreograph something for me, the contemporary piece. I said, okay, with my dancers? He said, no, with my theater actors. And I was just thinking, how are they going to do this? So he said, I said, okay, Karanji, when is the event? And he said, a week from now. And I said, okay, I took it up. It was a 10-minute choreography, nothing short. So I land up at the space, at the studio, and there are these 15 actors or performers, let me call them. And I said, okay, and it was about the concept of aviation. It was called Flights of Fancy or something like that for an Air India show. So I started working with them, and it was so easy. And within 2 days, I had transferred the choreography onto them. These were not dancers, but they lived this philosophy of learning and saturating their mind, body, spirits in such a way that they were perfect neutral ground to take on. And the funny part, I see Amy smiling, is that I kept calling Karanji and saying, Karanji, when is the music coming? When is the music coming? And costumes. I said, no costumes. They're going to just wear, their black t-shirts and tights, and that's it. I said, okay, music, you'll get it tomorrow. Till the day of the event, we didn't have music. And I was having babies, and the actors were all having a smoke and sitting around, checking their phones and all that, not bothered. They were used to this. And the music arrived 5 minutes before the show. And we all heard it for the first time on stage, and the actors did a fabulous job. To me, that was really a space, the space that, that they created of neutrality. I mean, just jumping from one to the other was absolutely fascinating, but I almost had a nervous breakdown doing that. We speak of it, but to see it that closely was actually quite scary and wonderful also. So is this the story, Amy? This one?
Yes, I mean, it's very related. The one that I remembered was the one where you said you were devising from your background based on experiences you had in New York, and you just waited basically for the new form to come through you. I thought that was really.
Would you like me to share that, or have I taken too much time?
I thought I'd love to hear. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
So this was a time about 20 odd years ago when I was still studying in New York. I was with the Limon Center and Marthagram Center, and I at one point started to miss both the fragrance and stench of India, and I felt I needed to create imagery that I was informed by as I grew up, etc., but also found a universal language. And having come back, I had to learn through trial and error, and revisited all the forms, and I looked at these forms now very differently from a space of neutrality in a sense, because I unlearned and learned everything again before I could transfer it into my to a vocabulary that we were forming, and which was both the sort of personified the collision and the mysticism of India in a sense in the body itself. So thank you.
There are some fascinating comments in the chat, and I'm wondering if we might start to pick those up now. Try to scroll up a bit, I think. So. Sorry, I'm taking a bit of time flying through. I'll go back if I miss anybody and come back. Hofan says, I connect to the idea of neutrality as pre-performance or reference point, a receptive place. So I wonder, are there specific qualities of a performer's neutrality? For example, I would argue that a performer's neutral is much more energized than an everyday state. Are there other qualities? Do these canvases vary from discipline to discipline? So I think I've put that as a kind of open question, comment, if anybody wants to respond to it, or Hofan, if you want to say more.
Yeah, hi everyone. So I'd love to say a bit more. So I trained under the Lecoq system, and then afterwards I came back to Hong Kong and I learnt with other disciplines, including, for example, Buto, a Japanese dance form, and so on. So I've been hearing a lot of very good definitions of neutrality that have to do very much about what I would use the metaphor of the canvas, in the sense that it is a foundation for a performer to be ready, to be present, to be receptive, and so on. So in that sense, it seems like under the title, it would definitely be a help, not a hindrance. But I would like to introduce this idea, because I've been through the Lecoq system, of when maybe certain neutralities become a hindrance, or there are different modalities of different neutralities that we can access. And I think that is where I'm interested right now, because I feel like being present as a performer, being open-minded, being ready, I feel like that's just the basis of performance. And just to add a little bit, I would feel like that this foundation is an energized state. It's a state that is more alive, more sensory open. And in some ways, it steps beyond our everyday time. So Madhu was very good when talking about the idea of circles and return. And I do believe that theater, we give a more intense experience, or performance in general, we give a more intense experience to people that is beyond their everyday experience of life. Through that, in dance, in Bhutto dance in particular, they talk about everyday time as linear. So we go from A to B very often in life. But where it becomes dance when we access cyclical time, or we access repetition, we access different understandings of time. So that as a foundation of neutrality. But I want to throw out this idea that Lecoq's neutrality is, I would characterize as very extroverted energy. Even the neutral stance, I would feel it's very energized in the hara, the center. We're projecting. We talked about projecting in the music hall, projecting two different spaces. We're throwing energy at the audience, pretty much. And I also feel there are different types of neutrality that do not just feed the audience. If you look at very classical Chinese films, and the woman in Cheongsam, and there's a different type of aesthetic, which is very interesting, similar to the Kingfisher, I think, in which the person has a presence, a particular feminine presence, that is very inviting and magnetic. And yet it's a very different type of energy than a type of throwing outwards. And I feel like in my journey in performance, it's important to be able to freely access both aspects, to be extroverted and to be introverted at the same time. Yeah, so I just want to throw this out there in the sense that having a flexibility, I feel like, as a performer is important. So I want to tease out qualities beyond just the idea of, okay, we're present now and open and ready for performance, and to look at the different modalities or campuses or accesses of different types of qualities that we can have, and maybe supported by disciplines and philosophies too. Because, for example, in Bhutto, the emphasis is not so much on a body. It comes, there is some Buddhist tradition behind it, in the sense that they believe that performers, and indeed us human beings, basically rent this body in this lifetime. So we should be able to discard and put on these different shapes that we shift in, right, and out of. And Bhutto is, you basically go from image to image and character to character in the dance. And all these, in that sense, the performer doesn't even exist. The idea is to get out of the way of the image and totally get out of the way of almost like channeling in that sense. Although a very skilled Bhutto performer, my teacher would say, you need to be half shaman, in the sense that you have a very strongly grounded aspect of technique. You're aware where the light is, you're aware of the audience, you know how to present. At the same time, you're actually channeling that particular image or that particular form. And there's a leap between the simile and the metaphor, in the sense when you perform, you don't become like a cat, you become a cat. Like mentally, you just have to shift into that place. And when you shift into that place where you are that thing, then there comes the receptiveness that Ellie was talking about, in the sense that it is new. You are, that presence informs you of the thing. So yeah.
Can I respond to that, Frank? Is that okay? Yeah, that's fascinating. I think I haven't really talked about it as a performative, as a way into performance, although I know that it's accepted as that. I feel that it's a gateway into creativity, into making making your work. I wouldn't describe Lecoq's pedagogy as a system. That's what I really feel. I think it's an approach to learning, which you take what you want from it. But I do think that there is a double flow of our attention, that I don't think it's just being aroused by the external world. I think it's also, you know, the inner and the outer, and that connection between. But it's really fascinating that you're connecting it to Butoh, because they are all interrelated. That's me, Madhu.
Yeah, just to listen to Hopa and you, Ellie, I think I was just thinking, you know, neutrality is almost, to me, I think it's about coming home in a sense, you know, before taking off to whatever it is that I am being that day, whatever it is that I am becoming, when I'm becoming my dance in that state. And I remember, I think, listening to these whirling dervishes of Konya as they're sitting down and as they're meditating. They say that when you have the realization that there is an inner and outer order that you're, you know, constantly trying to navigate, but in this case with rhythm. So I think also another point about Butoh that you were making, I think in Indian dance also we have, and I think I would say dance theatre, Jihan would agree, especially when you look at the folk forms, operatic forms, we have the whole concept of unity of space and time. So you move around one circle around a room and you're in heaven. You move around and you've moved to a cave somewhere, you know. And so I think to be able to not only look at what you are becoming or not, but to the juxtaposition of space and time also going on constantly, and you're working within the parameters of a form which by itself is very complicated. I think there has to be a very strong sense of home and neutrality in order to do that. And I definitely think in the context of today's discussion, is it help or hindrance? I would go with help.
Thank you. We've gone over the 45-minute time, and I tried to make a couple of interventions and I realized I had myself muted, so they didn't work. So we've gone over the 45 minutes. We can go for another 5 minutes of recording, I think, if people would like that to happen, or we could just settle with neutrality being about home and then play from there. Does anybody want to commit anything to the record, or should we just move into closing the recorded session and moving into the more free-for-all? Jihan saying close. Okay, so recording off then. Thank you.